Richard was 21 the night it began. The air of youth hung about him like a coat he wore too proudly, stitched from arrogance and freedom. He had always been the kind of man who treated each fleeting romance as a story written for him, a small chapter to toss aside when he grew bored. But that night, in a dim apartment with music humming low, something shifted. When she left in the morning, laughing lightly as if their connection had been nothing more than passing fun, Richard felt a sudden, unsettling pang, a fear of being forgotten. For the first time, the temporary nature of his conquest left him uneasy. He rifled through the sheets, the clutter, until his hand fell upon something small, delicate, and charged with memory. He slipped it into his pocket without thought, a keepsake of a moment already vanishing. Back in his apartment, he opened his dresser drawer and placed it carefully at the back, as though he had planted a seed. A strange satisfaction coursed through him, sharp and private. The drawer closed with a click that felt like a promise. Days turned to weeks, and another night, another fleeting romance, came and went. Again, he kept the token, this time deliberately. The ritual formed almost unconsciously. It was not lust that drove him now, but the compulsion to preserve. Each keepsake became proof. I was here. She was mine. I mattered in this moment. By the end of that first year, the drawer held several objects, each carrying the weight of a night Richard could not bear to let dissolve into nothingness. He told no one. It was his secret, his private mythology. He did not yet realize that with every token added, he was building not just a collection, but a prison. The drawer did not remain a secret curiosity for long. What had begun as an impulsive act soon became a ritual, a part of Richard's rhythm as steady as brushing his teeth or buttoning his shirt. Every new encounter demanded a token. Every fleeting night was incomplete until he had something to slip into his pocket. Not for use, not even for memory, but for the preservation of a feeling he could not name. In his 20s, Richard was a man adored for his confidence, envied for his charm. He moved through crowded rooms like a flame, drawing people close, basking in the warmth of their attention. Women laughed at his stories, admired his reckless spirit. And when the evenings ended, when the city fell quiet, Richard always made sure he returned home with proof that he had been wanted. The drawer grew heavy with these proofs. At first, he had placed them neatly, arranged like treasures on velvet. But as the months blurred into years, order gave way to chaos. The drawer no longer whispered. It groaned under the weight of what he forced upon it. Sometimes, when he opened it late at night, he would pause and stare, unsettled by the sheer number of lives reduced to tokens in his possession. And yet, he could not stop. The habit had fused with his identity. To walk away from it felt like erasing who he had become. His friends joke about his endless adventures, calling him lucky, a man who lived without regrets. They never guessed that behind his polished laughter was a hunger, one that left him lonelier with every passing year. On the nights he could not sleep, Richard would sit in silence and slide the drawer open, letting the past breathe out at him. A strange mixture of triumph and unease stirred in his chest. Each token was both victory and chain. He touched them with the reverence of a priest at an altar, unable to decide if he was worshipping his freedom or his captivity. Richard told himself he was building a history. What he did not yet see was that the drawer was not preserving his life, it was consuming it. By the time Richard reached his 30s, he had mastered the art of appearances. The reckless young man had sharpened into a polished professional, suited and well-spoken, the kind of man who was invited to boardrooms and weddings alike. People looked at him and saw success. They saw a man who had conquered the chaos of his youth, who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. But Richard knew better. Every morning, he adjusted his tie in the mirror, but behind his eyes lingered a secret weight. The drawer, his hidden archive of conquests, still waited in the corner of his bedroom, tucked behind neat shirts and pressed trousers. It was never far from his thoughts. In moments of silence, he could feel it humming in the background of his mind, like a pulse he could not quiet. He smiled easily at colleagues, laughed loudly at parties, and even comforted friends who came to him for advice. But it was all performance. The real Richard, the one who lived behind the mask, was restless. He could not decide if he despised his ritual or depended on it. At times, he convinced himself it was proof of his desirability, his dominance in a world where everyone else faded into mediocrity. At other times, he felt like a thief, hoarding pieces of people he had no right to keep. The mask grew heavier with each year. There were nights he would come home late, peel off his jacket, and sit on the edge of the bed staring at the drawer without opening it. His reflection in the window looked back at him, successful, respected, untouchable, and yet hollow. He wondered if anyone else saw it. If, in his laughter, there was an edge too sharp. If, in his charm, there was a desperation too obvious. But no one ever asked. No one ever looked close enough. And Richard, skilled in deception, made sure they didn't. The mask protected him, but it also suffocated him. What he didn't yet know was that soon, someone would look past it and see the truth. There was a time when Richard felt a rush each time the drawer grew heavier. It had been proof of his allure, evidence that he could claim experiences others only dreamed of. But somewhere along the way, the thrill had thinned into a dull echo. Now, when he opened the drawer, the sight did not electrify him. Instead, it left him strangely tired. Each token was supposed to be a triumph, a reminder of nights worth remembering. Yet as he stared at them, they blurred together, indistinguishable fragments of encounters that had long since lost their meaning. What once felt like victory now looked like debris. Richard tried to ignore the change. He told himself a ritual still mattered, that it defined him, that it was proof he hadn't wasted his youth. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had built a museum of moments that had never really belonged to him. He wasn't preserving memories. He was preserving his loneliness. At work, colleagues envied his charm. Friends clapped him on the back, calling him lucky. Women still found him magnetic, but the sparkle had dulled. Richard felt it whenever he smiled, the effort it took to play the part of the man everyone thought he was. There were nights he sat in his apartment, the city buzzing faintly outside, and tried to remember the faces behind the tokens. Some he recalled easily, their laughter, the way they looked at him across a crowded room. Others had slipped entirely from memory. That realization chilled him. If he could forget them so easily, what did that say about him? About what he valued? The drawer, once a source of pride, had become a silent accuser. It no longer whispered of freedom and conquest, but of waste, of repetition, of something vital missing from his life. Richard closed it one evening and rested his hand on the wood, heavy with a sudden question. What now? For the first time in years, he did not feel triumphant. He felt lost. Richard first noticed her at a gallery opening he had attended out of obligation rather than interest. The room was filled with chatter and clinking glasses, people admiring canvases more for the prestige than the art itself. He stood near the back, rehearsing his usual mask of charm, when his gaze fell on her. Sarah did not move like the others. She wasn't trying to impress or be seen. She stood before a painting with quiet focus, tilting her head as if she were listening to it speak. Something about her stillness, her lack of performance, struck Richard more sharply than any laugh or glance that night. He found himself drifting toward her, offering one of his well-worn lines. To his surprise, she didn't respond with easy laughter or coy interest. Instead, she looked at him plainly, as though weighing him in silence before deciding if his words were worth the time. For the first time in years, Richard felt disarmed. They talked, not about him, not about work or clever anecdotes, but about the painting in front of them. She spoke with a clarity and honesty that caught him off guard. When he asked if she often came to these events, she smiled faintly. "Only when I forget how boring they are," she replied. Something in that answer lingered. Richard was used to being the one in control, the one others orbited around. But with Sarah, he felt the ground shift. She wasn't dazzled, and she wasn't playing his game. She was simply herself, unfiltered, uninterested in his carefully polished mask. Over the next weeks, they saw more of each other. Coffee turned into dinners, dinners into late-night walks. With every conversation, Richard felt something loosening inside him. Sarah's presence was like air in a room he hadn't realized was suffocating him. And yet, beneath the warmth she brought, a shadow stirred. Richard still had his drawer, still had his secrets. Each time Sarah laughed, each time she looked at him with unguarded trust, he felt both joy and dread. For the first time, he feared that if she ever discovered the truth, it would destroy the fragile new beginning he didn't even know he wanted until now. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and like this video, please. Richard had never believed in the idea of falling. To him, relationships had always been transactions, charming words exchanged for fleeting warmth, laughter traded for brief comfort. But with Sarah, it was different. He didn't fall all at once. He unraveled slowly, almost against his will. Their days together became a rhythm he craved. She brought lightness into his structured world, urging him to skip meetings for a walk in the park, teasing him when he tried to overanalyze her favorite books, teaching him how to linger in the ordinary moments. With her, he learned to sit in silence without feeling the need to perform. For the first time, Richard felt seen, not for the mask he wore, but for the man beneath it. But love, as he discovered, was not a clean slate. The drawer remained. Though hidden away, it lived in the background of his mind, pressing against him whenever Sarah's laughter filled the room. He began to dread the nights he returned home alone before she moved in. The silence seemed louder, the drawer heavier. He would sit on the edge of the bed, staring at it as though it were mocking him. "You don't deserve her. You're still mine." Richard told himself he was strong enough to resist. Yet, temptation had a rhythm all its own. On several nights, he rose quietly, careful not to disturb Sarah, and approached the closet. His hands trembled as he slid the key from its hiding place. He would stare at the drawer, imagining what each item meant, imagining the lives he had touched and left behind. And yet, when he thought of Sarah, the ache of guilt surged like a tide. He realized, bitterly, that it was no longer about desire. It was about compulsion, about the need to preserve a past that he could not reconcile with the life he now wanted. The drawer had ceased to be a trophy. It had become a chain, binding him to memories he could not release, even for the woman he loved. Some nights, he wept quietly into his pillow, wishing he could erase a ritual, wishing he could be the man Sarah deserved. The contrast between his former life and the love he now felt was unbearable. The tokens were no longer proof of conquest. They were proof of his own failure to evolve. And still, he could not bring himself to throw them away. The decision came to Richard one crisp autumn evening, though in truth it had been forming in him for months. Sarah's presence had woven itself into every corner of his life, her voice on the other end of a late-night call, her books scattered across his apartment, the warmth of her hand in his when the world seemed unbearably sharp. She had become not just part of his days, but the very reason he wanted them to continue. And so, when he found himself standing before a jeweler's glass case, the drawer weighed on his mind more than the diamonds. He told himself this was the answer, the way forward. A proposal wasn't just a promise to her. It was a pact with himself. If I marry her, I can leave the past behind. The drawer will lose its hold. He chose a simple ring, elegant and understated, much like Sarah herself. He rehearsed the words in his head for days, imagining the way she would look at him, the way her eyes would soften. And beneath that hope lingered a current of fear, not fear of her answer, but fear of his own lies. The night he asked, they were walking along the river, city lights reflecting in the dark water. Sarah leaned into him, laughing at a story he half finished, when he stopped suddenly, his heart pounding. He dropped to one knee, fumbling for the box, his polished words scattering into the cool air. "Sarah," he said, his voice rougher than he expected, "you are the only part of my life that feels real. I don't ever want to let that go. Will you marry me?" For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then Sarah's eyes shimmered, and she whispered yes. The ring slipped onto her finger, sealing the promise. Richard pulled her close, her laughter spilling into his chest, her joy undeniable. For the first time, he felt something like absolution. But later, when they returned to his apartment and Sarah dozed in his arms, Richard's gaze drifted toward the closet. Behind the door, the drawer sat silent. He had locked it away, but he knew it was still there, watching, waiting. The wedding was everything Sarah had dreamed of. Sunlight streaming through high windows, laughter echoing across the reception hall, their closest friends and family gathered to celebrate the union of two souls who, at least in that moment, seemed destined. Richard played the role of the perfect groom with practiced ease, but this time the performance wasn't empty. He truly loved her. When Sarah walked toward him down the aisle, her smile radiant, Richard felt a stirring deep in his chest that silenced every doubt, every secret, if only for an instant. Their honeymoon was a blur of travel, intimacy, and shared wonder. They wandered cobbled streets, tasted foods they couldn't pronounce, and fell asleep tangled together, their laughter lingering in the air. For Richard, it was intoxicating. For the first time in years, the drawer seemed distant, like a shadow that sunlight couldn't reach. Yet shadows have a way of waiting. Back home, as they settled into married life, Richard found himself slipping into routines that felt unfamiliar. Sarah decorated the apartment with a quiet touch, framed photographs, small plants, books spilling across tables. Their home no longer looked like his alone. And while the warmth of their shared life filled him with comfort, it also left him uneasy. At night, after Sarah had drifted to sleep, Richard sometimes lay awake staring at the ceiling, his chest tight. He hadn't opened the drawer since the wedding, but he could feel it there, waiting in the dark. The thought gnawed at him. What if Sarah stumbled across it one day? What if she saw the tokens and understood what they meant? He told himself it was locked, buried deep, irrelevant now. But the more he tried to bury the thought, the more it rose up inside him. Marriage hadn't erased the past. It had only hidden it behind a door he was too afraid to open. Sarah noticed nothing at first. She was radiant, content, her trust in him unshakable. And Richard clung to that trust desperately, even as the weight of his secret pressed harder with each passing day. The honeymoon glow was fading. What remained was love, and the shadow of a drawer that refused to be forgotten. Sleep had never been easy for Richard, but now it became an unrelenting battleground. The hours after Sarah's soft breathing had become the loudest moments of his life. He lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, feeling the quiet weight of the drawer pressing against his chest. It had been weeks since the wedding, and though he had told himself the tokens no longer mattered, he could not rid his mind of them. At first, it was subtle, a passing thought as he walked past the closet, a flicker of curiosity when he reached for his jacket and felt the key tucked inside. The drawer remained locked, but in the silence of their shared bedroom, the object within seemed alive. Each token whispered promises and regrets, reminding him of nights that were gone but not forgotten. Richard told himself he was strong enough to resist. Yet, temptation had a rhythm all its own. On several nights, he rose quietly, careful not to disturb Sarah, and approached the closet. His hands trembled as he slid the key from its hiding place. He would stare at the drawer, imagining what each item meant, imagining the lives he had touched and left behind. And yet, when he thought of Sarah, the ache of guilt surged like a tide. He realized bitterly that it was no longer about desire. It was about compulsion, about the need to preserve a past that he could not reconcile with the life he now wanted. The drawer had ceased to be a trophy. It had become a chain, binding him to memories he could not release, even for the woman he loved. Some nights, he wept quietly into his pillow, wishing he could erase a ritual, wishing he could be the man Sarah deserved. The contrast between his former life and the love he now felt was unbearable. The tokens were no longer proof of conquest. They were proof of his own failure to evolve. Sarah had always been perceptive, noticing details that others overlooked. At first, it was small things. Richard's restless eyes in the middle of the night, his delayed responses to casual questions, the way he seemed to tense whenever she approached the closet. She told herself it was nothing, a quirk of his personality, until the unease settled like a shadow over her heart. Dinner conversations grew tense in subtle ways. Richard laughed when prompted, but the lightness that had once defined him was occasionally hollow. She asked him if he had been thinking about work or if something was troubling him, but he waved the concerns away with practiced ease. His answers were always polite, always careful, always leaving her with the faintest echo of doubt. Sarah began to notice patterns. Doors he locked more frequently, drawers he seemed to check twice before opening, even the way he sometimes touched the closet handle absent-mindedly, almost as if drawn by gravity. The sense that he was keeping something from her gnawed at her, a quiet persistence she could neither ignore nor fully name. It wasn't suspicion alone that troubled her, it was intuition. She had learned it in life to trust the small signals, the unspoken hesitations, the silences that spoke louder than words. And Richard's silences had begun to speak in a language he could almost decipher, though she didn't yet know the story behind them. One evening, after a night of restless conversation and soft laughter, Sarah lingered by the bedroom doorway, watching him move around the room. He didn't notice her at first, lost in thought, pacing near the closet with a tension that made her stomach tighten. She didn't know why, but something inside her whispered that the life he showed her wasn't all of him, that the man she had married carried a weight she had yet to see. And in that quiet, watching him from the shadows, she realized that their life together, as perfect as it seemed, had cracks. Small, hidden cracks, but cracks nonetheless. The question she could not ask yet began to form in her mind. What is he hiding? It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Sarah had been tidying the bedroom while Richard was out running errands, her hands moving almost mechanically through the piles of books, clothes, and scattered papers. She had long sensed his unease, the subtle tension that clung to him even in their happiest moments, and though she didn't know why, she felt a need to understand. Her eyes fell on the closet door, the one Richard always seemed to approach with care, almost reverence. A small curiosity tugged at her. She reached for the handle, hesitant, feeling a strange mix of fear and resolve. The door opened with a soft creak, and there it was, a drawer tucked in the back, small and nondescript, yet impossibly heavy with the aura of secrets. Her fingers traced the edge of it, and instinctively she pulled. The drawer slid open, revealing its contents. At first, she didn't fully comprehend what she saw. Objects carefully folded, each one representing a person, a night, a life she had never shared with him. The realization hit slowly, like a cold wave washing over her chest, each detail sinking in with unbearable clarity. Sarah felt a sharp ache, a betrayal that wasn't just about the object but about the years of secrecy. Every laugh, every tender moment, every shared story now carried a weight she had never imagined. She stepped back, her hands trembling, as if the drawer itself had a pulse and had just revealed her worst fears. And still, he could not bring himself to throw them away. When Richard returned, he found her standing there, pale and trembling, the drawer gaping between them like a chasm. His chest tightened, the world narrowing to the single, overwhelming knowledge that his secret was no longer his own. I didn't know, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. I had no idea. Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to explain, to make her understand that it was a ritual of the past, not a reflection of his love for her. But the words faltered, stuck somewhere between guilt and shame. The room seemed impossibly quiet after that, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. The drawer, once a source of hidden pride and secret comfort, had become a monument to everything Richard feared he could never undo. For the first time, he saw not just the consequences of his actions, but the fragile life he had built with Sarah teetering on the edge of collapse. Richard's heart pounded in his chest like a drum he could not silence. Sarah stood across from him, arms crossed, eyes wide and hurt, and for the first time in years, he felt completely exposed. The drawer, small and innocuous in appearance, had become the epicenter of everything he had hidden, everything he feared, everything he was. I don't understand, Sarah began, her voice trembling. Why? Why would you keep these? Richard swallowed, the words catching in his throat. He wanted to speak, to explain, to make her see that it wasn't about desire anymore, that it had once been a compulsion, a misguided attempt to preserve fleeting moments he now regretted. But how could he condense years of secrecy into a sentence? How could he convince her that the drawer represented not conquest but his own failures? I don't know how to start, he admitted finally, voice low. It started years ago. I thought I could control it. I thought it didn't matter. But it became a part of me, a secret I couldn't let go of. Sarah's gaze softened slightly, but the hurt didn't fade. A part of you, she echoed. This is a part of you. All this time, I thought we were building something real, and all the while... Her voice broke. All the while, you were keeping pieces of other people. Richard shook his head, stepping closer. It's not like that. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted this to touch what we have. Each one of these, they aren't people to me. They are reminders of a life I shouldn't have lived. And now, with you, I can see that. I want to be better. I have to be better. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she did not look away. The silence stretched between them, a fragile rope of tension and emotion. Richard felt his chest tighten, the weight of the drawer like a leaden stone on his heart. I need to make this right, he whispered. I'll destroy it, every last piece, if it means I can start over with you. But I need you to know. I love you. I love only you. Everything else was mistakes. Only mistakes. Sarah exhaled slowly, her anger and betrayal tangled with her love and pain. For the first time, Richard saw not just a hurt but the possibility of forgiveness, a bridge across a chasm he had created. if he had the courage to cross it. The drawer sat on the bed before him, silent and unyielding, as if it knew the weight of the moment. Richard's hand hovered above it, trembling, unsure if he could truly let go. Years of habit, of compulsion, of secret triumph and shame were contained within that small, unassuming space. Destroying it would not just be a physical act, it would be a symbolic death of the man he had been. Sarah stood beside him, her eyes steady, filled with a mixture of grief, caution, and hope. She did not touch the drawer. She let him take the lead, knowing that the act had to come from him, from the man she loved and hoped would survive this moment of reckoning. Richard opened the drawer one last time. The tokens lay there, reminders of fleeting encounters and careless nights, a history of mistakes frozen in time. He picked up the first item, holding it delicately as though it were a fragile relic of a life he no longer recognized. A wave of nostalgia and guilt swept over him, choking him. He almost put it back, almost kept it one more day. But then he looked at Sarah, the woman who had transformed his world, and he felt a resolve harden inside him. One by one, he lifted each object, placing them into a box. His movements were deliberate, ritualistic, cleansing. Every piece he removed carried the weight of his past, and with each passing moment, he felt that weight lessen. When the box was full, Richard set it aside and reached for the matches. He hesitated only for a heartbeat, then struck the flame. The fire leapt eagerly, devouring the remnants of a life that no longer belonged to him. He watched as each token curled, blackened, and disappeared, the smoke carrying away years of secrecy and shame. Sarah placed her hand on his shoulder, grounding him. No words were needed. The act itself spoke volumes. Richard felt a strange mixture of liberation and sorrow. The drawer was empty now, but more importantly, he felt something stirring within him that had been dormant for decades. Hope. For the first time in years, Richard realized he could exist without the chains of his past. And for the first time, he understood that love, true, unguarded, honest love, could survive the shadows of former mistakes. The days that followed were quiet, almost painfully so. The physical act of destroying the drawer had been decisive, but trust, Richard quickly realized, could not be reclaimed with fire alone. It had to be rebuilt, painstakingly, with patience, honesty, and the small, persistent gestures of love that Sarah now required. Richard moved with a newfound humility, conscious of each word, each glance, each action. He no longer took Sarah's presence for granted. He listened more, laughed less perfunctorily, and allowed himself to be vulnerable in ways he had never dared before. Every shared meal, every casual conversation, became an opportunity to prove that he could be the man she deserved. Sarah, too, navigated the fragility of their new reality. She oscillated between anger, sorrow, and hope. There were nights she would wake alone, memories of the drawer flaring in her mind, and she would wonder if a forgiveness was enough. Yet, she stayed, watching Richard's every choice, gauging the honesty in his eyes, feeling the authenticity of his effort. Slowly, like cracks in ice warming to spring, trust began to seep back into the spaces between them. They began speaking differently, openly, without pretense. Richard confessed more than he had ever before, not just about the drawer but about his fears, his regrets, his longing to be better. And Sarah, in turn, allowed herself to speak of her pain, her disappointment, and her hopes for a future that no longer carried the weight of secrets. The process was uneven. There were moments of doubt, arguments that flared like storms, and silences that hung heavy in the air. But there were also moments of grace, laughter that was lighter than ever before, touches that carried reassurance, and nights where they simply sat together, letting the world exist outside their small bubble of reconciliation. Richard knew that nothing could erase the past, and Sarah knew that scars would remain. But together, they discovered that healing was not about perfection. It was about persistence, about choosing each day to trust and to love, even when it was hard. And in that fragile rebuilding, Richard began to understand the depth of what he had almost lost, and the promise of the life he now truly wanted. The drawer stood empty now, a silent monument to the life Richard had left behind. He ran his hand over the smooth wood, feeling a strange lightness he had never known. It had been years of compulsion, of secrecy, of holding on to fragments of lives that weren't his to keep. And now, for the first time, he could breathe freely. Sarah entered the room quietly, pausing at the doorway. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not judgment, not suspicion, but a calm patience, the quiet assurance that they could move forward together. She didn't need to speak. Her presence alone affirmed that love, though tested, could endure. Richard exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of decades lift from his shoulders. He knew the past would always linger, like shadows on the wall, but it no longer had the power to define him. The ritual that had once chained him to his mistakes was gone. In its place was honesty, vulnerability, and a connection that could not be broken by hidden objects or unspoken truths. He turned to Sarah and smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. "It's over," he said softly. "All of it. Everything that kept me from being fully here. It's gone." Sarah stepped closer and took his hand, a small gesture of trust and renewal. "We move forward," she whispered. "Together." Richard nodded. Together. The word resonated, carrying the promise of life rebuilt, of love no longer burdened by secrets. He thought of all the nights he had spent staring at that drawer, caught between desire and compulsion, guilt and longing. And now, that chapter had ended. The empty drawer no longer represented loss or temptation. It was a reminder of survival, of growth, of the courage to confront the past and leave it behind. Richard felt something stir within him that he had never allowed before. Hope. He turned toward the sunlight spilling through the window, Sarah at his side, and for the first time, he felt whole. The past was gone, but the future, uncertain, bright, and shared, awaited them. And for the first time in his life, Richard believed that he could embrace it without fear.